Okay, so for my next video, I wanted to cover a little bit about how HF radio works and how to select the frequency you're using to communicate with whoever it is you're trying to communicate. Y'all can already tell this is an extremely low effort YouTube channel and YouTube video, so in keeping with that, I've got a piece of transparency film taped to my fridge, and I'm just going to kind of diagram these things out. So, any radio you can hold in your hand and the antenna is small enough to be walked around with is probably going to be in the VHF or UHF spectrum, or maybe in upper HF. But the frequencies are going to be very high, and those frequencies are not going to reflect off of the atmosphere. They're going to be basically line of sight. So I've drawn here a little bit of terrain right there. And then I have different, the atmosphere up here, I have different layers. And we'll get into this a little bit later. But the gist of it is, if there's any amount of terrain between you, like between this station and this station, there's this kind of mountain in the middle, they're not going to be able to communicate with handheld radios. Even this station and this station with just a little bit of a rise of a hill. Or if you're in the field and you get in just a tiny bit of a draw or a tiny bit of a valley and you lay prone, you might not have radio contact anymore. For anything beyond line of sight, and there's a little bit that goes into that, right? Like radio waves can reflect off of certain things and they technically refract around terrain features a little bit, but the gist of it is it's mostly line of sight. Anything beyond that, you're going to need to use HF radio that has propagation through the ionosphere. And the gist of it is your radio signals are going to come up into the sky. They're going to go through this first layer, the D layer, and then they're going to hit the E layer, and they're going to reflect or refract. They're going to refract, really, off of that layer and then come back down, and then they're going to hit the station that you're trying to talk to. So the signals are coming from up in the air. Depending on how far away the station is you're trying to talk to, you might need to use a different frequency to be able to communicate with them, because there are a couple of different forces acting on your radio waves. So the first one we're going to talk about is what's the difference between all of these frequencies, right? Radio waves have a frequency. It's usually just given as F, right? And for HF, the frequency is between, I think lower HF is considered 1.8 megahertz all the way up to 30 megahertz. And this is a really interesting slice of the radio spectrum because how they behave is extremely different on the lower end to the upper end. Higher frequency means you get more energy per radio wave. Sorry for my terrible handwriting. Let me get a little bit of alcohol here so I can rewrite that. So higher frequency, it gives you more energy. Not more watts. Your watts might be the same, but the energy per radio wave you send out is higher when you have a higher frequency. Lower frequency is less energy. And what you need to do is you need to tune the amount of energy you're putting out based on who you're trying to talk to. So talking about these layers of the ionosphere, the D layer is the lower layer. And what this layer does is it actually absorbs radio waves. And the lower energy radio waves get absorbed a lot faster than the higher energy radio waves. So the D layer is going to basically eat up your signal, and you need to get through it. So whatever you pick has to have enough energy to get through the D layer. The E and the F layers will refract your radio wave and bend it around to turn it back towards the Earth. But they also aren't unlimited in their ability to do that, right? The higher the energy, the more likely it is that instead of getting refracted, it's going to punch right through into space. And you might be talking to the moon with that, but no one on Earth is going to hear you. So you need to pick something between the two. So what also affects it is the angle of incidence. And the angle of incidence is the angle at which your radio wave is hitting the atmosphere. So at a shallower angle, if your radio wave is hitting at a shallower angle, it spends more time in this D layer than if it were to be a steep angle. If it goes straight in and straight out, it spends not a whole lot of time in this D layer, and it's less time that it's absorbed. So lower energy radio waves will be more likely to work if they're coming straight up and straight down. If they're coming far out into the horizon here, they spend more time in the D layer and they get eaten up and absorbed, right? Now, the opposite, the same thing is true for the E and the F layer. The angle of incidence makes a difference. Higher energy radio waves are harder to refract. So if you put a high energy radio wave going straight up, it's going to punch right through into space. And if you put it going at a very shallow angle, it's going to have plenty of energy to get through the D layer. And then when it gets to the E layer, it's going to have a lot more time to get bent back around and come back down to Earth. So what you need to do is you need to balance your frequency based on how far away you're talking and what the atmospheric conditions are. So for now, let's just talk about the daytime. We'll get into the nighttime a little bit later. But say I'm trying to talk to this guy right on the other side of the mountain here, and he's maybe 100 miles away or 50 miles away. This is realistic emergency preparedness distance, by the way, right? I know people will get on like CB radio and they'll talk about how they heard a guy from California and they're in, Florida. That's great, but he's not going to be able to help you. He's too far away. Can you hear people in the other county? That's what you really need to worry about. And depending on the conditions, you probably can't. So if I want to talk to this guy, let's say first I try at a relatively high frequency. I try at 14 megahertz, which is known as the ham radio 20 meter band. It's 14.0 to 14.3, if I recall. I could check the band plan, and some of that's Morse code and some of it's voice. Doesn't matter. 14 megahertz. That's a high frequency, high energy radio wave. And what it's going to do is it's going to come right through, and it's going to get through the D layer, no problem. It's going to punch through that, no problem. And then it's going to get the E layer, and it's going to kind of start to refract a little bit, but it's going to punch right off into the space, and he's not going to hear me. He's too close. Now, that same signal that I'm putting out, my antenna's throwing radio waves in all directions, might go out here at a shallow angle, spend more time in the D layer, not a problem, it's got plenty of energy. And then in the E layer, it's spending a lot more time here because it's at a shallower angle, and it might come down, and I might be talking to some dude in France, right? He might hear me clear as a bell, but my buddy 50 miles away can't because the radio wave is going over his head and not at his antenna. And that's called being in the skip zone. So in that case, this area here is the skip zone. The higher your frequency, the longer your skip zone. Now, I might also try way down at 1.8 megahertz. So let's say 14 megahertz, large skip zone. Now, 1.8 megahertz is a very low frequency, very low energy. And even at this close distance during the day, that one might get eaten right up by the D layer. Doesn't matter what angle it's at, it's just so low energy that the D layer is just going to eat it up. That's more or less, that's practically an AM radio band. It's extremely low frequency, very low energy. So that would be too low. And no matter the angle, it's just not going to get through the D layer. And then I might say maybe 5 megahertz. This would be around the 60 meter band. So 14 megahertz is 20 meters. 1.8 megahertz, I think that is 160 meters. I never operate on 160, so I can't remember. 5 megahertz is roughly the 60 meter band. I actually really love the 60 meter band. The problem with it is you get a very narrow chunk of frequencies you're allowed to use as a ham radio operator. You get 5 specific frequencies, channels even. Ham radio doesn't usually use channels, but they do on the 60 meter band. And that's all you're allowed to use, and there's limitations on how you can use them because they don't want us to use a lot of it. They want those frequencies to be relatively clear because there's a lot of important communication going on there. What that tells me is that the 5 megahertz band is valuable, and they're only willing to give hams a tiny little chunk of it because they've got a lot of uses for it, and we are not high priority on their list, right? So that should give you a clue that for some reason, this particular chunk of HF is really useful. I love the 60 meter band. It's kind of underutilized. Now that one will have enough energy to get through the D layer, but it's not so high energy that it'll punch through the E and F. And I have clear communication with my buddy 50 miles away, right? Perfect. That's the frequency that I'd want to use. Now, depending on the day, they can vary. So let's start talking a little bit more about what can cause the conditions to vary day to day. And this all comes down to the sun, right? So the sun is kicking off all sorts of stuff. It's kicking off light, it's kicking off radio waves, it's kicking off X-rays and gamma rays, it's kicking off solar flux, which I know it's a thing, couldn't really tell you what it is. I'm not really that technical, but it doesn't really matter. What I know is that the more active the sun is, where we are in the sunspot cycle and what time of day it is and day-to-day variations, you get more solar rays hitting the atmosphere. And those solar rays do two things. They charge up this E and F layer so that it's more reflective, but they also make this D layer a lot bigger and a lot thicker so it absorbs more. So the more solar activity you have, the higher the frequency you're going to want to use for the same type of communication, because it reflects more and it also absorbs more. Now, the sun varies day to day and how much radiation it kicks off, but you know what happens exactly every 24 hours that affects how much solar radiation you're getting right where you're standing is the day-night cycle, right? So when you're on the dark side of the Earth, the sun is on the opposite side of the planet, you're not getting a lot of solar radiation, and it takes a little while for this to all calm down, but shortly after sunset, you get a lot less reflection and a lot less absorption, and your frequencies need to go down. So during the day, you will use higher frequencies. During the night, you will use lower frequencies. So let's take this same example, and let's say it's nighttime now. And where did I put my little bottle of alcohol? It's nighttime now, and this D layer is pretty much gone away, right? It's there, but it's not very big, and it doesn't do a lot of absorbing. Now that same 5 megahertz that worked great during the day might just punch right through to space now. So the same signal, because the E and F layer is a lot thinner and a lot weaker now, I'm not going to use 5 megahertz anymore. Now that 1.8 might work great. 1.8 is really low. I don't really like to go that low, partly because I don't have the antennas that big. That might be when you might want to use 3.5 megahertz or 4 megahertz. That's the 80 meter band. So 14 megahertz is a large skip zone. 3.5 megahertz and 4 megahertz is great for nighttime. You can do a little bit of work on the day on 3.5, but it's kind of tough. There's a lot of noise that kind of gets in the way, and your signal gets absorbed pretty heavily. So it's primarily a nighttime and evening band. And the 5 megahertz, I consider kind of a Goldilocks band. You can use during the day. And I didn't really plan this out well. The other one you want to work on is 7 megahertz. That's the 40 meter band. I would actually consider 20 meters to be pretty much useless for prepping, because the skip zone is so large, it doesn't work practically at all at night. And during the day, you're talking to people who are at least like 500 or 600 miles away, right? I haven't exactly measured it, but every time I talk to someone on 20 meter band, they're at least half the continent away. So 14 megahertz, don't really worry about it for prepping and emergency preparedness. It's a lot of fun. And if you want to impress your buddies, it's great, because you can be like, hey, look how far away I can talk. The antennas for it are nice and small. By the way, higher frequency, smaller antenna, easier to set up, easier to tear down. Lower frequency, much bigger antenna. But 14 megahertz basically is not going to be useful for you for prepping. So, during the day, you use a higher frequency. During the night, you use a lower frequency. So for close range, you know, maybe like say less than 100 miles. That's a lower frequency, right? Because you need it to be able to not punch through to space in the E&F layer. For long range, higher frequency, right? So nighttime long range might be your daytime short range frequency because of the way that the day and the night vary a little bit. So 40 meters, for example, is great during the day, and then at night it goes long and it acts kind of like 20 meters at night. So let's get down to brass tacks and just kind of tell you as a general rule of thumb what I would recommend. I would say if it's daytime, you should be looking at the 40 meter or 60 meter band. I kind of prefer 60, but depending on the day and depending on the conditions, 40 meters might work for you as well. During the nighttime, you might be able to get away with 60, but you're probably going to want to go for 80 meter band or maybe 60, depending on the conditions. Probably going to stick with 80. So 80 meter is definitely the way you'd want to go there. And on this one, you might do 40. So I hope that explains things a little bit. I don't want to belabor the point too much. And there's a lot of highly technical articles that are written about this topic that honestly just kind of turn my brain into mush. But this is my understanding of HF propagation. It kind of makes a lot of sense to me, and it helps me to understand what's going on with the radio waves. And this is why when somebody tells me that their CB radio is getting great NVIS propagation, I can tell them, well, CB radio is right up here at 28 megahertz, and it's not going to do NVIS very well because it's going to punch right through to space when it's pointing directly up, which actually reminds me, I never really discussed what NVIS was, so let me get back to that real quick. So NVIS is something a lot of people like to talk about. It's got this weird kind of aura to it where everyone's like, oh, NVIS, it's this tactical military radio stuff, and it's this special type of propagation that requires special antennas, and I want to do NVIS. What do I need to do NVIS? All you got to do NVIS is use a lower frequency. That's it. All that NVIS means near vertical incidence Skywave. So Skywave just means radio waves that have propagated off of the ionosphere and they're coming from the sky. Near vertical incidence just means your angle of incidence is near vertical. So your radio waves are coming almost straight up and almost straight down, which is great for guys who are real close to you, right? It's the equivalent of instead of taking a water hose and pointing it out that way, you just point it straight up and it all comes down in this nice little semicircle around you, right? So going back to what we learned earlier, what kind of frequencies do I want to use for going nearly straight up? I want to use low frequencies because the D layer is not going to have as much of an effect because they're coming straight in and straight out, not spending a lot of time at a long angle. And it needs to be low enough frequency that the E&F will reflect it. So during the day, that's probably going to be 7 megahertz and below, 60 meters or 40 meters. 40 meters is on the high end. During the night, it's going to be 80 meter or 60. So basically my recommendations here are for NVIS. But don't get wrapped around the angle or wrapped around the axle about what kind of antenna you need. As a rule, the antennas you need for NVIS are pretty simple. A low wire that's pretty full size for the frequency, and it's better if it's horizontal and not too high off of the ground. But honestly, when you're trying to put up an antenna portable or you're trying to put up your first antenna, it's probably going to work fine for NVIS because you're not going to be building a crazy high directional antenna that's designed to beam energy out to the horizon. Don't overthink it. Just get a wire in the air, use the appropriate frequency, and you'll probably be on NVIS. The only thing that I would say is avoid a vertical antenna, because vertical antennas actually don't put out a whole lot of radiation straight up in the direction of the antenna. But if it's not a vertical, if the wire is, kind of 45 degree or horizontal, you're probably going to be fine. So it was a little bit disorganized and unrehearsed and extremely low effort and low budget, but I hope it was instructive. If you have any questions, feel free to put a comment on the video, and I will see if I can follow up on them. Hope it was useful.